quality, and the main purpose of this lecture material is to point out how difficult it is to measure quality in sensory tests. And that's the message of what this whole outline is about. First of all, everybody speaks very glibly about quality. You see it on the television advertising. You see it in slick newspaper advertising about quality. And we do think that it's related to sensory quality, and there is some chance that sensory panels might be able to measure it. Even if it were not true that a sensory panel was able to measure it, we might get some clues between the general nature of quality and some physical and chemical measurements, which will be the last lecture of the course, and that we might then be able to predict some of the parameters of quality from that. So we're always looking for that correlation. I've looked a lot of places for definitions of quality. There's one in Kramer on quality control, his quality control book. This one is a more general one, and the trick in this definition is the greatest number of ideas. What do we mean by ideas? Well, you could substitute for ideas the greatest number of sensory responses as another possibility. But I've put it in very general terms because you not only get a sensory response, but you also get ideas from the sensory response. It reminds you, a Burgundy wine reminds you of velvet. And you think of velvety and so forth. And so you superimpose over the actual taste of the softness of the wine a lot of other things. Anything that gives you a lot of different ideas, whether it's to the viewer and looking at a picture, or the listener of music, or the taster, in the shortest possible time. Otherwise, a really true great work of art you recognize almost at once. A really true, you may be able to look at the Mona Lisa and find new things for a long time, but the minute you look at the Mona Lisa, you realize that you're faced with a picture that is, in a way, different than any picture you ever saw before. And you don't know whether she's smiling or not. Does she represent the femme fatale idea, or is she just a beautiful woman? What is she trying to say? All of those factors go to make up the quality of the Mona Lisa. Now, you ask the question, where is the quality? This is the old Berkeleyan question. Is quality in the product, or is quality something that exists only in the mind of the viewer or the observer, or is it something of both? Well, perhaps it's something of both. I think the answer to that is the picture itself has to have something, but you have to have some response to it. And if it's something you're not familiar with at all, you won't have any response. It's still the same work of art, but if nobody looks at it, is it truly a work of art? And then I've said before, and it's easier to recognize than it is to define. When we get down to the nitty-gritty of defining the quality of any one wine or any one food, that may be quite difficult. In many cases, it depends not just upon a single item, but several. A box of apples. It's not just only one apple that makes up the box, but it's the whole box of apples. Their uniformity of color, of size, and so forth. Or the sanitary nature of meat. Bruised chicken that have been bruised in the defeathering job and so forth will taste just as good, but will not have the same quality in the observer's mind. And then in some cases the nutritional factors will be important. How much fat does it have in it and so forth. Well, I've then defined it again. Quality is made up of many parameters and their interactions with each other and with the consumer. And now we've got some 6 of them here that we try to think about. First is what we now call hedonic tone. That means the pleasantness and unpleasantness of the product. Hedonic tone does. And in recognizing hedonic tone, some experience is necessary. If you don't have any framework of reference, if you don't have something to to know. The first time you say it's pleasant, and then later on you say it's not so pleasant. Finally, you may get to hate it later on. The first time you went to a Slater's dining room, you were just new on the campus, and you were away from home. You hadn't eaten out an awful lot before that and so forth, and so it sounded like it was all right. Now you hold your nose and they drag you into Slater's to get you to eat there and so forth. Not truly that, I'm making a joke about it, but it's certainly not as good quality-wise as it was the first time you ate there. Next is the person's preference. We all differ from each other. Some people like tart things, some people like sweet things, some people like gritty things, some people like smooth textured things, and so forth. They will affect the quality reaction. Then experience. That is your habit, your cultural patterns, how you were raised, whether you were spanked for eating candy before you came in the house before dinner, which give candy a specially delectable taste to you ever afterwards because you were doing something you were not supposed to do, and therefore it tasted better for you. It was a stolen pleasure type of thing. Or in your house you may have had religious customs or cultural patterns or just household patterns. There's going to be beans and hot dogs on Sunday night, and your preference is always for that or against it, whichever way it may turn out to be. Your appetite determines to a certain extent your quality factor. Hungry people appreciate food more. Now, that's not completely true. You can get to the stage where you cannot eat if you get sufficiently hungry. People in battlefield situations, particularly people that have had shock, are found not to be able to eat. They have to be fed intravenously in some cases. They will reject all food. Their stomach is all tied up in knots and so forth. People who have terrible worries, they may be just dying of hunger, but they won't eat anymore. They won't have any preference for food at all. People in the hospital, you can bring them in the most delicious tidbit and ask them how it tastes. And they taste like chalk, or it tastes like straw, and so forth. Yes?
What about people who are really hungry and then have a tendency to eat very rapidly?
That's true, but you got to have, and I think it's a very good point, and thank you. They get at just the right stage of hunger, you'll eat anything. But where there's any, what I was trying to say in the case of appetite, if you're all full up, you're not going to taste the next morsel of food, and it's not going to look very good. You're going to reject it because you have what we call, good word, thank you now for reminding me of it, you have satiety. And under those circumstances, quality preferences are very difficult to make. You have satiety. You're full up. Now, we showed in the very first lecture that people that were on low sugar diets would then have different preferences for sugars than people that were not on low sugar diets. That seems to be true of people on low salt diets and so forth. A higher level of sugar is pleasurable. When you're on a very low sugar diet for a period of time, your blood sugar goes way down, so that when you taste higher and higher sugars, it gives you more preference. That's not true when you have sugar in the blood and so forth. And then finally, complexity is one measure of quality. How does complexity operate? Well, it could operate in various ways. One way, it could keep us from getting tired of something because each time we looked at it, we would see one other aspect of the food, more complexity. The French say that's why that using sauces on food is very desirable, because they make a very complicated sauce. Start with some vegetables and some soup bones, and then you clarify the sauce, and then you mix the sauce with tarragon or something like that, and finally you come out with something to put on the food that is a mixture of a great many things, and they said that adds hedonic tone, it adds enjoyment, it adds quality to the food. Of course, there are some doubters in our midst who says that the French do that because French raw foods are not very good anyway, and by putting a lot of sauce on them, they cover up all the poor quality of the raw food. That's the other side of the coin. But anyway, complexity is one measure of quality. Very simple things that we get tired of. and with greater complexity. I suppose the whole nature of eating is to provide a variety of complex things for us. We start with some soup or maybe a couple of nuts or a cracker or something, and then we have, if it's a big dinner, we have some fish, and then we have some, after that we have some meat and maybe a salad and cheese, and then maybe a dessert to quench our, and at no time do we get tired of anything. We're constantly trying new things as we go along. Well, then quality is a fusion of qualities, food qualities it should be there, as determined individual by individual, varies from one individual to the other. Therefore, since quality is individual by individual, varies from one individual to another, and it's a value judgment, it's a subjective judgment, therefore all quality scales are two-tailed scales. And I suppose I ought to say it that you must accumulate, you do not make means at the start. In most experimental situations, if you're doing now where you're doing greater or less of something, you can make means, because there is going to be some central tendency. But you can't do this on quality judgments very often. You have to keep looking at your data and sort the data. You may find that you have 1/3 of your population that likes a very low sugar-acid ratio. In other words, they like tart things. And then you may have 2/3 of your population over here who like a high sugar-acid ratio. In other words, they like things that are very sweet and have practically no acid. They like very sweet things. And they don't like... Now, if you make means of this type of data, assuming that everybody is the same, you cover up these two groups here. And you get these kind of things in quality judgments quite frequently. So you have to look very carefully at the panels that are there. How does the past experience contribute? Well, now I must introduce another new word, a word called funding. Funding is the ability that you gain with experience to feed in all of your experience to your judgment. You fund your present experience out of your past experience. As for example, you're tasting God forbid, parsnips for the first time. And you neither like them or dislike them, or you may dislike them a lot. But after a period of tasting parsnips, then you fund out of your experience with the past your present judgment. So you say, this parsnip is tough, this parsnip smells like it's been left in a pile of moldy parsnips for a long time. And therefore you get, funding means the acquisition of a frame of reference. That's what funding means, the acquisition of a frame of reference. And we do funding with everything, with reading novels, with listening to music, with looking at pictures, looking at buildings, or eating foods, or judging foods. There's no substitute for this, the frame of reference. In a new situation, you can't be expected to make a rational judgment because you have no basis for making the rational judgment for a new type of food. I chose parsnips because most of you don't eat parsnips very often. I was looking for something new and different. Maybe I should have said Iranian caviar. That would be something to look forward to. But the first time, as a matter of fact, the first time I had Iranian caviar, I wasn't quite sure I liked it. Now I've decided I like it best of any of the caviar. But even with that, until I had quite a lot of tastings in Russia and Persia at various times, I didn't know what the petroleum smell was. But the Caspian Sea is getting lower and lower, and they're getting more and more of these, and they're drilling for more oil out in the Caspian Sea, and you're getting more and more of these petroleum-flavored caviars, and you had to learn that. If you didn't, you might say, well, caviar is supposed to taste like petroleum. Suppose you'd gotten a petroleum caviar, the first one you got, You didn't know that it was petroleum. You'd say, well, maybe I don't like petroleum, but if it's going to be in caviar, and caviar is supposed to be good, then I'll say that petroleum tasting caviar is good. Well, this the bottom part of there just reiterates what I've said before. And on the other side, there is a school of thought now that says that if difference can be demonstrated, then preference can also be demonstrated. It may not be demonstrated right away, but eventually with more experience you can make quality judgments. Question of what do you mean when you say the meat tastes good? But to the inexperienced person, this is just to emphasize again that you have to have some experience to do this kind of judgment. It tastes good because it looks good. To somebody else, it tastes good because it's big. To somebody else, it tastes good because it's thick. To somebody else, it tastes good because it's got the right color. Somebody else, it tastes good because it smells nice. And to somebody else, it tastes good because the texture is just right. It's nice and juicy. But presumably, it tastes good in the final analysis because all of the relevant parameters that make up the quality of the steak are known to the observer, and he then funds his experience, so he puts in all of his frame of reference, and he makes a judgment that the meat is good. People obviously are going to differ in this. You're going to have this situation occurring quite frequently. Now, I've already talked about this the other day. De gustibus non est disputanum mean that individual judgments are so individual that measures of central tendency cannot be used. Always examine your data to answer that question. Sort your data out and look at it to be sure that that is not true. Because here, measures of central tendency do not apply. You cover up the real differences between two groups of people if you make an error, if you make a measurement of central tendency. There is some people that feel that quality also has to do with, in the final analysis, that quality has to do with the incomparability of a quality object. You can't, finally is so unique and distinctive that you can't compare with anything. That it forms its own frame of reference within itself. You may feed a lot of things into it. And I think that's much easier believed when you think of painting or you think of a great aesthetic experience in nature and so forth. The Yosemite Falls, for example, in June of this year is something that you couldn't compare with anything else in the world. Foods, it's a little bit harder to think of that, but I suppose at some stage of your life that you will say, this is the best apple pie that I've ever had. And it is truly at that stage incomparable with any other. It's above any other apple pie when you say that. I hope that you can say that many times, that until you get to be very old, that you're constantly getting better food, but that doesn't seem to be the way the world works. Well, that 16 just says what I've said above here. Oh, I go back to 14. There's often a large effect of small differences in composition on the quality. That is true. And that's why the inexperienced person sometimes misses those. I estimate that approximately half the population cannot get corkiness in red wines. They're just simply immune to that defect. About a third of the population is immune to sulfur dioxide in white wines. Now, both of these are negative quality factors to the experienced person, and they truly do detract from the quality of wines. But many people, they're present either in such small amounts or that they can't recognize them, and therefore they overlook them. Is flavor of critical importance to the ordinary consumer? This is a quote from a paper that I gave the International Food Science Congress a few years ago, or some meeting I was at, I can't remember where now. Well, perhaps not, but the idea of improving people's appreciation of the food, since you spend a good part of your life working in order to get enough money to feed yourself and your family, that the idea of doing it better, developing the taste or developing the skills to make something better is worth doing. And I think that the large companies would be well advised to consider this. The first part of this century, we just tried to produce more wheat to the acre, we just tried to produce more apples to the acre, we tried to keep the bugs off of them, and we tried to make them more uniform. And lately, we've been trying to make them more nutritious. But I would also think that a good objective of food technology in the last part of this century, the last quarter of this century, would also to make things more worthwhile, more enjoyable, more quality-minded to eat, not just to fill your stomach up. Otherwise, it seems to me you're missing one of the pleasant things of life. Quality is probably not related to demand. I can conceive of a hamburger that's better than a filet mignon, and I can conceive of hamburgers that are worse than filet mignons too. Not related to price. It's not completely related to pleasure, because pleasure without experience is not the whole thing. Or even the hungry person that we just mentioned a while ago that eats real fast. He's not paying any attention to quality. He's just taking care of his hunger, and he doesn't have any pleasure reaction or anything. He's just feeding his hunger pains. It's quality is more than any one of these things, although maybe related to each of them. Now, I've given you a fourth definition of quality here now. True quality creates its own intuitive recognition of quality. You know that it's quality if you have some experience with that, looking at that kind of a food, and then it comes out, you immediately say, well, it has everything. It's got the right color, the right shape. You can tell a pie, for example. 90% of the pies in America are bad because they're soggy dough. And that's one-third the pie is the dough. And most bakeries don't know how to make crisp dough. They don't want to put any butter in it to make it crumbly and so forth. So you can tell whether a pie is going to be good or not by just looking at the slice. And if it's all doughy and water-soaked under the bottom and so forth, you know you're not going to be able to eat the rest of the crust. And that's a low-quality thing. So intuitively, you know that if the pie is made that way, that it's not going to be very good. So you can recognize a lot of these things. But the most important thing is complexity. And complexity creates what I call memorability. If you don't talk about the apple pie, it isn't any good. If you don't talk about it, it isn't any good. Unless or if you don't talk about it bad, of course, it's no good either. If you can't say something, you can't remember something about it. Give your husband or wife a big kick for making such a bad one, or a big kiss for making such a good one, you know that it didn't make very much impression on him or her. Anyway, the reason I've given this particular lecture is most people think quality is very easy to measure. It's very difficult to measure. One of the biggest problems we have in sensory evaluation.